It's one of those moments in life where you need to pinch yourself. I sit there asking if this is actually happening. I'm sitting in a small Honda, hurtling down a highway with two people who until 24 hours ago I'd never met. My wife, Claire, and I are sitting in the back seat. I can feel her hand grasp tighter into mine with every bump and turn. As we look at the window, all we see is the blur of a Bangladeshi countryside whizzing before our eyes as we fly down the motorway. Except this is not a motorway as we would expect in New Zealand. Only some sections of the road have been completed. That, however, does not stop our driver. He simply moves across to the other side of the road, which has been completed to a slightly higher, yet still not great standard. It does not seem to matter to him that the road is not completely sealed. He just powers through at breakneck speeds. There is a lot of weaving between traffic and going over bumps as we cross between those uncompleted sections of road. Eventually, we make it to a city with busy streets and people everywhere, which thankfully slows our driver down to safer speeds. This part of my story took place in 2015 when Claire, my wife, and I we had the chance to spend 2 weeks in Bangladesh, helping at a school in Dhaka, which is the capital. And while we were there, we had the opportunity to visit our sponsor child. We set out on an incredible journey from Dhaka north to a tiny village on the border with India. We were in a hired car that came with a driver and our Asian Aid representative, Salman, who was also our translator. This drive up, which I've been sharing, can best be compared to a kid's video game with many levels and stages. You know those classic games like Sonic the Hedgehog, where there are obstacles to deal with along the way. With your character, or car in our case, bouncing over things and collecting stars and points as you go along the journey. Often each level has a theme in these types of games, with the levels getting progressively more difficult as you go further through the game. The first level we encountered, I would call the motorway level, and after passing through that last big town, we headed onto roads that continued to become narrower the further we went. The next level after that, I would call the rice fields. The road was gravel at this point, with what seemed like more potholes than roads, and as far as the eye could see, there were rice fields. Some even had games of cricket going on in the middle. The next level was all about bridges. Now, in Western countries, when there's a bridge, it's generally considered common sense to ensure that the road meets the bridge correctly. However, due to lack of infrastructure and frequent monsoon rains, the ramp that connected to many of the bridges had actually just washed away. And so every time we went over a bridge, I waited for that inevitable scraping of the underside of the car onto the start of the bridge. The next level I would have simply called mud. At several points, the driver attempted to navigate this thick, sticky mud, and at one point we actually had to get out of the car to lighten the vehicle. I remember standing on the side of the road in this random village, thinking there is absolutely no way the driver is going to get through that mud. Yet, after a few earnest prayers and several wheel spins, he made it through. We were actually later told that they did not remember the last time a small car had travelled to the school. It's usually only accessed by large vans and scooters. After successfully navigating the mud, the steep bridge entrances, we arrived to our destination, which was Monasapara Adventist Seminary, which is where our sponsor child goes to school. It was a rewarding sign at the end of a long journey. Behind the big gates sat a lush, well-kept oasis in the middle of desolate farmland. It's safe to say that the journey that day was one of the more adventurous things I've done in my life. So what does this crazy car ride have to do with anything? I believe that our lives, and in particular, our spiritual lives, can be compared to this trip. Just like in an arcade video game, throughout our lives, obstacles come our way, and we have to best navigate through the different seasons or levels of life. I remember when I was 17, listening to a preacher speak. He shared that whole, if there's one thing you need to listen to today, This is it, sort of a line. And in fact, he took it one step further and basically claimed that he had the one answer to help us understand our walk with Christ. Now, I'm usually quite skeptical of these type of lines, but this one in particular has stuck with me. He simply said, our spiritual life is a process. And I would like to paraphrase that and say that it is a journey. We do not just come to the conclusion one day that we've made it and we are as close to Jesus as we ever could be. It is also not a matter of just, getting baptized and all of a sudden we have made it. Instead, it's an ongoing process. Now, often in life, we think that our journeys are going to look like this, when usually they look much more like this. I've thought about this sort of concept many times over the years. We all go through seasons in our personal life, and we definitely experience highs and lows in our spiritual walk. Sometimes I feel like I'm on fire for God. I'm spending time daily with Him and wanting to share His love with others. Other times, I slowly drift away, often caught in the busyness of life, or sometimes for no apparent reason at all. I slip in my daily devotions and spend my time elsewhere, away from God. Yet, the most crucial thing is that we keep coming back, because Jesus is never going to give up on us. Another analogy that can be used to explain this phenomenon, and one which particularly resonates with me, and probably my mother, is that life is like a race. Sometimes there is running and sprinting, but often mixed in with equal measures is tripping, falling, and crawling. One of the most inspirational stories of a race is that of Olympic athlete Derek Anthony Redmond. He's not famous for winning medals. In fact, the British 400 metre runner didn't even make it past the semi-final stage at the Olympics. But it was his determination to finish that will forever live in the minds of millions. Now, injury had forced Redmond to withdraw from the 1988 Olympic Games in Seoul, just 10 minutes before the start of his 400 metre heat. So he felt he had everything to prove at the Barcelona Olympics 4 years later. Not to his peers, but, as he admitted later, to himself. Redmond wanted a medal, whatever the colour, and he started well, qualifying for the semi-finals by clocking the fastest time in his heat. As the guns signalled the start of the semi-final, Redmond charged out of the blocks, making good speed over his first 250 metres. But it was at this point that his right hamstring gave way. He pulled up sharply as the rest of the field ran away from him, leaving Redmond on his knees, crippled, with his Olympic dream over. The anguish on his face was clear for everyone to see. What followed, however, is one of the most memorable moments in Olympic history. Redmond got back to his feet and tried to finish the race. In an act of true courage against adversity, Redmond could only hop on one leg towards the finish line. Pain was etched on his face as each step became more painful than the last. However, Redmond would not give up. He had promised himself and his father that he would finish the race, no matter what, and he was determined to keep that promise. He was about halfway to the finish line on one leg and crying in desperation when a man could be seen entering the track and pushing through the race marshals. It was Derek's father. He put his arm around his son and supported him to walk the final section of the track. Several times the marshals attempted to stop him, but he told them to go away, and he continued to support his son to the finish. The moment Redmond crossed the finish line brought 65,000 spectators to their feet in a standing ovation, many also in tears. I share this story as, although it was a short journey, it paints a really good picture. Sometimes in life, out of nowhere, we can fall and be hurt. But it's at those times in our lives when we need the support of others. We need someone who will help us up and carry us until we are able to carry ourselves. You might be in a place in your life where you need someone to put their arm around you and help you towards the finish line. Or you may be the one who can represent Derek's father. Is there someone you know who is struggling in their journey? Perhaps all it will take is putting your arm around them or giving them a quiet word of encouragement. We can also look to the Bible to find more examples of how life is a journey. One of the most famous, or perhaps infamous journeys in the Bible lasted for 40 years. For 40 years, the Israelites journeyed by wandering in the desert. Their journey seemed extremely pointless at times, just going around and around in circles and spending most of the time arguing. I actually find the story of the Israelites quite challenging. I always begin by thinking, how on earth could these immature people be so pig-headed and forgetful after all God has done for them? Their journey is full of instances where they sin and rebel against God, only for God to forgive them and give them a second chance. And yet, they never seem to learn. I tend to get quite judgmental when I think about how infuriating this group of people is. And then I start to think deeper, and isn't that exactly what I do? Sure, I might not erect a golden calf, but I do slip away from God, even after all the goodness He has shown me. So how can I be so stubborn and forgetful? But sometimes it's during our struggles or our journey through the wilderness that God can teach us the most. God knew that the wilderness was an ideal place to test His people and to help them learn faith and endurance. The Israelites were always going to have to go on a journey through the wilderness to reach the promised land. We know from Deuteronomy 1 verse 2 that it should have only taken about 11 days to go from Horeb to Kadesh Barnea, which was on the border of the promised land. Yet it took the children of Israel 40 years to make the journey. They got stuck in the wilderness because of unbelief, and I also believe because God had a few things to teach them on the way. Deuteronomy 8 verse 2 to 5 explains how God was working on His stubborn people. It reads, "Remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the wilderness these 40 years, to humble and test you in order to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep His commands. He humbled you, causing you to hunger and then feeding you with manna, which neither you nor your ancestors had known, to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. Your clothes did not wear out, and your feet did not swell during these 40 years. Know then in your heart that as a man disciplines his son, so the Lord your God disciplines you." And I think that the last line there is key. That as a man disciplines his son, so the Lord your God disciplines you. During this whole process in the wilderness, God was teaching them, molding them. Often it was tedious and extremely slow work, but God was constantly working on their hearts. Even when they were far away from Him, He continued to pursue them. I think that it's amazing that no matter how far you walk away from God, it only takes one step to get back. It took the Israelites 40 years to learn the lessons God was trying to teach them. Sometimes our wandering and problems are actually chances for God to grow us. Like the Israelites, there is another key example in the Bible of someone who took a long time to learn. This person is one of the most interesting characters in the Bible, the disciple Peter. His life can definitely be described as a journey. He was able to spend 3 years in a close relationship with the greatest teacher this world has ever seen, and yet he is still denied his best friend and Lord. I believe that Peter is one of the finest examples of character development in the whole Bible. He went from being an erratic, self-seeking fisherman to a wise, powerful leader of the first church. And yet even this new Peter did not get it right all the time. Despite learning from his journey with Jesus, he still made errors in judgment later in his ministry. In Galatians chapter 2, we find an account of a disagreement between Paul and Peter, where Peter appears to be acting in a hypocritical manner towards some of the new believers. Paul actually had to challenge Peter on this matter. So even though Peter showed huge growth throughout his journey, he still didn't get it right all of the time. He still made mistakes and would have needed to seek the Lord's forgiveness. I think there are some conclusions we can draw from Peter's life. Firstly, none of us are perfect, but we do all have positive character traits. Next, growth can be made in even the most stubborn person, like Peter. And finally, we all have things we need to work on. The other aspect I'd like to share about our journeys in life is that we have to work very hard to avoid what can be called the comparison trap, as we are all on different journeys. We need to remember that everyone is going through different things, and therefore we cannot judge others or compare ourselves to them. Just because someone spends more time in the Word each day than us does not mean that we should give up. But it also doesn't mean that we should try to compete. But equally, we should not look down on others who may be struggling with their faith journey. Instead, we should be seeking to help those people. How can you help others on their journey? Perhaps you know someone like Derek Redmond who has tripped and fallen and is struggling. Could you play the role of the father? Could you put your arm around someone in need and allow them to lean on you? Now, I'm the principal of our Adventist school in Invercargill, and our school has a vision that's simply growth. And it's actually an acronym that gives ways in which you can grow. But exactly what growth looks like, however, is different for every student. Each child comes to our school with different circumstances. For the child who struggles to sit and complete any tasks set by the teacher, growth is actually when they finally manage to complete one small piece of work without any help. Another student may perform amazingly academically, but struggle socially and have difficulty making friends. Growth for them may simply be having a positive social interaction with a classmate. And in another student, they may struggle with self-confidence. Growth for them would be gaining the courage to share their answer with the class. Therefore, what success looks like is completely different for each child, depending on their journey. And this is exactly the same for us as adults in our walk with God. He is not concerned with how you stack up against others. He just wants to see us growing in our relationship with Him. We can't compare our journey to that of others. This concept that our walk with God is a process sometimes frustrates me. I often feel a lot like the Apostle Paul, where in Romans chapter 7 and verse 15, he says, "I do not understand what I do, for what I want to do, I do not do, but what I hate, I do." Now, I know what it takes to grow in my walk with God. Things like daily spending time in His Word or praying, not just for things I need, but having an open conversation with Him. Or meeting with others to discuss the Bible. It is all quite simple, really. And yet those things I cannot consistently do. So I guess this sermon is really for myself. My message today can be looked at in a couple of ways. As to truly understand that life is a journey, we must realize that we need to have a balance. Firstly, sometimes we actually just need to cut ourselves some slack. Life is hard. Sometimes things happen which are really challenging, and they affect our walk with Christ. Thankfully, God will always forgive us, even when we stuff it up, time after time after time. Remember, no matter how far you walk from God, it only takes one step to get back. But secondly, this does not mean that we should just give up and say that it's all too hard. We should keep pressing on towards the goal, run the race, and even when you want to stop and give up, that is exactly when you should keep going, remembering that life is a process. Now, I've had the pleasure, or as many of you may say, pain, of running 3 marathons in my life. The second one, which was in 2014, I can quite easily compare to a spiritual walk. I started off feeling great. The first 10 Ks, that felt like a breeze, but after that, I started to feel the tendon in one of my knees tighten. My last few weeks of training had been hampered by this problem, but I was hopeful that it would not affect my race too much. I was at about the halfway mark when the pain really started to kick in. I began to wonder how I would be able to get through to the end of the race. I nevertheless continued as I watched my hopes of beating my previous time slip from my grasp as my pace dropped off. As I approached the marker which said 6 kilometres remaining, the pain and doubts became much stronger. I remember slowing to a walk to collect water at one of the drink stations. I will never forget the difficulty I experienced as I had to get my seized knee moving again into a run after stopping to drink. The next 6 kilometres were painstaking to say the least. Yes, my body was exhausted and my knee was killing me. But more challenging than that was the mental battle. Everything in my body was telling me to quit. I came up with a simple mantra to keep me going. Every step I take is one step closer to the finish. Every step I take is one step closer to the finish. I just kept repeating that. As my running became slower and slower, I just became more and more determined to complete the race. I simply had to keep on running. I will never forget the raw emotion that flooded over me as I entered the finishing chute, as crowds were gathered, cheering on the finishing runners. The feeling I had as I crossed the finish line is one of the greatest feelings I've ever felt. The feeling of complete and utter exhaustion was overpowered by a feeling of pride and accomplishment that I had done it. I had finished the race. I had reached the goal. If that is the feeling I received from simply running a race, imagine what the feeling will be like when we reach the finish line on our race on earth and get the prize of spending eternity with our loving our Saviour, Jesus Christ. Hebrews 12, verse 1 to 3 says, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. Let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart." I pray that you will continue to run the race, that you will complete the journey. I hope that every time you find yourself struggling in your walk with God, you will have the courage to seek help and come back. I pray that, like our car trip through Bangladesh, you will be able to navigate all the crazy levels of life that get thrown at you. That you will be able to keep reaching, keep striving to grow in your walk with God. Keep taking one step after the other, even through the pain that life throws at us. Knowing that through all the twists and turns, ups and downs, God will keep coming back for us. He will be there for us on our journey, no matter what. I pray that you will keep striving and running the race so that you will be able to reach the prize of eternity. Amen. I'd invite you all to stand as we sing our final song, "All the Way My Saviour Leads Me."